All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope we are doing well this morning. My name is Maisie. I am an educator at the Milwaukee Public Museum, and I am so excited to be hosting our last Learn with an Expert of the school year. So we have a really fun guest today. His name is Dr. Josh Kapfer, also known as Doc to his students. And he is a professor and he is also a wildlife biologist. And he also helped write, he co-edited the kind of the book on amphibians and reptiles in Wisconsin. And so we are so excited to have him. Just so you are aware, we do say this is best suited for grades 6 through 12, but anyone is welcome to join. I will tell you it's going to be about an hour, give or take. And well, we'll cut off around the hour, right? And there is an opportunity for you to ask Doc Kapfer questions in the chat. So if you are connecting on Zoom, I will ask you to use that Q&A function so I can see your question really easily. And if you are using YouTube, you can always sign in and ask those questions via the chat on YouTube. So like I said, I'm really excited to have Dr. Kopfer here, and I'm going to let him take it away and tell us a little bit about his work as a conservation biologist and a professor.
All right. Thank you, Maisie. I appreciate it very much. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about these concepts of ecology and conservation to all of you. And so when we talk about these, we're going to talk about them in sort of a general sense so that we can better understand what they are. And, hopefully by better understanding what these mean, ecology and conservation, it will help us be better at enacting conservation into the future, because I'm a wildlife biologist and really interested in vertebrate ecology and conservation. So these are topics that are very important to me. So why don't we go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about ecology. So ecology is something that many of you, it's a term I'm sure many of you have heard before, but it's really useful to talk about what ecology is, to sort of define ecology so that we can have a better understanding of it. Because it's one thing to hear a term over and over again and have kind of a vague understanding of what it means, but it's another thing to actually have a usable definition of that term. So we classify ecology or define ecology as the study of quote unquote interactions. Now, interactions can be lots of different things, right? So interactions in ecology can be fall under the umbrella of, first of all, organisms interacting with their surroundings, or their environment. Now, when we consider the environment of an organism, we're frequently looking at things like temperature, right? So temperature is one aspect of the environment that organisms have to interact with. So in this figure, we have this lizard, and the lizard is interacting with temperature because they are cold-blooded or ectothermic. That means they don't produce their own body heat like we do. They have to absorb heat from either the sun with radiant heat or absorb it from warm rocks or soil. So they interact with their environment in that way. We also consider environmental interactions to involve water, right? All organisms need water to survive, whether they are plants or animals. They need some access to water. Some organisms need more water than others, right? Clearly, things that live in water, like fish, need more access to that aspect of their environment than something that lives in the desert, like that lizard in the picture here. Another example of an interaction that organisms engage in with their surroundings is shelter. So many organisms have to find shelter from predators or shelter from competitors, or maybe shelter from the elements, like shelter from too much heat from the sun, or if it's raining too hard, shelter from some of those other environmental elements. So ecology is the study of interactions first at the level of the environment, so individual organisms and populations of organisms interacting with their environmental surroundings. But ecology interactions span beyond the environment, also encompass, I should say, interactions with other living organisms. So if we think about interacting with the environment, we're talking about interacting with things that are not living, right? Temperature is not living, water is not living, but ecology also reviews or encompasses interactions with other living things, right? So there's lots of ways in which organisms interact with other living organisms, right? A classic example would be in finding mates. So this male lion interacting with the female lion in the background as a mate, but also with another competing male lion. So they're competing with each other over access to that female. So that is an interaction between two living organisms. Another example of an interaction between living organisms would be in the acquisition of food, right? So this snake is a living organism and it is consuming this other organism that was recently alive, in this case, the rodent. But acquisition of food is another example of interactions between living organisms. So ecology involves studies of interactions at various levels, interacting with the environment, interacting with other living organisms, and this can become very complicated. So this shows us the sort of example of what we might call a food chain, right? And a food chain is a representation of how energy moves throughout an ecosystem, right? So energy coming in here from the sun and helping that grass grow. That energy then is sort of sequestered, or it's inside of the tissue of that grass through photosynthesis. And then the grasshopper eats the grass, that energy moves to the grasshopper. The frog eats the grasshopper, that energy moves to the frog, and so on. So a food chain like this shows us a sort of simple way in which energy moves through an ecosystem, right? Between the non-living, the heat and the sunlight, to the living of the plant and the grasshopper, etc. But the reality is that ecological systems are also are infinitely, I should say, more complicated than what we would see in a food chain. Here's an example that shows a slightly more complicated interaction with how energy moves through ecosystems. So this is more what we would term as a food web, right? So we can see there are in this food web, way down at the bottom, the organisms that are acquiring energy or capturing energy from the sun and turning that into biological energy through photosynthesis. Above that, we have the things that eat those sort of photosynthetic organisms, those plants. We have the things that eat those things that eat the plants. And then we have at the top the coyote, the mountain lion, the bobcat. And what's important to understand about a food web is that it shows not just one path along which energy can move through an ecosystem. So here we're showing just one path along which energy can move through an ecosystem. A food web shows us all of the different interconnected paths along which energy can flow through these different ecosystems. So we have, for example, not just a raven potentially eating something like a Pacific tree frog. There's also the ringtail, the marten. There are all of these other organisms that will eat a Pacific tree frog, right? And it's not just the mountain lion that potentially eats the black-tipped jackrabbit. It can also be eaten by a coyote or a bobcat. So it's showing all of these complicated interactions. And so this is one of the really interesting things about ecology, is that we're studying interactions. These interactions are really, really complicated, and that might seem a little bit scary or intimidating when we try and first study ecology, but it's also exciting because we have so many different avenues along which we can think about how organisms interact with their environment and their surroundings, right? Now, ecology is a general sort of discipline of study, right? And what's really cool about ecology is that we have to use information from all sorts of other disciplines of studies to understand how organisms interact with their surroundings and other living things, right? So as ecologists, it is very common for us to use information from all of these different disciplines, right? Botany, the study of plants; chemistry, the study of chemicals and chemical interactions; geology, the study of rock formations; geography, right, the study of where things are located. So if we think about what I do, I am primarily working with animals, right? I'm primarily working with organisms under the context of sort of zoological interactions, right? And that's part of ecology as well. But as an ecologist who studies animals, I'm also thinking about the types of, if they're a herbivorous animal that eats plants, the types of plants they eat. That draws on botany, where they live across the sort of range of places they can exist. That draws on things like geography, right? How heat transfers to them. That could draw on geology because rocks can be hot, they can be cold, organisms can absorb that heat, and so on. So ecology uses information from lots of different disciplines. And so frequently, when we think about ecological interactions, we're thinking about heavy or high integration between different disciplines. In other words, we're pulling information from all of these different disciplines, we're bringing it together so that we can understand how it is these organisms interact with each other organisms, and also with the environment around them. So these types of interactions require us to have heavy integration in our knowledge, in our information. And so people who study ecology can have expertise in geology, or they could be experts in geography. They can obviously be experts in zoology or botany as well, but also chemistry. It's just thinking about how these different disciplines or areas of study integrate with each other when we're trying to understand the ecology of the organisms in question. So ecology can also look at sort of sub-disciplines within something like zoology. So in other words, among or within the sort of study of zoology, there are lots of different sort of smaller studies, areas of study that people can have expertise in. So, the study of amphibians and reptiles is herpetology, right? And a lot of my research is and interests are in herpetology, right? As was mentioned, I co-edited the book on amphibians and reptiles in Wisconsin. I've published lots of research on amphibians and reptiles. And so a lot of my sort of work is with amphibians and reptiles in the sort of discipline of herpetology. But ecology, you don't have to be just a herpetologist if you want to study ecology. I mean, there is ornithology, which is the study of birds. There is mammalogy, the study of mammals, right? There are ichthyology, the study of fishes, right? There are all of these different sub-disciplines. And honestly, even though oftentimes I'm identified by people as a herpetologist, I'm really a wildlife biologist. I'm really interested in all sorts of different types of organisms. And so I've published on not just amphibians and reptiles, but mammals and fishes, et cetera, as well. And so I have done those types of studies with other experts in those fields. And so you don't have to be pigeonholed in as just a herpetologist or just a mammologist. Ecology is such a broad and diverse sort of dynamic area of study that you can have lots of potential interests and you can follow lots of potential avenues as a person who is interested in ecology and conservation. So in a nutshell, what we've talked about so far is what ecology is. It's the study of interactions between organisms and their environment and organisms with other living organisms. We've talked about various aspects of what ecology draws on. It requires integration between lots of different disciplines. And we've also talked about different ways in which ecologists can focus on certain areas like herpetology, or focus on lots of different types of organisms, more like a wildlife biologist. So this might actually be a good time to stop for a moment and take some questions if anybody has them, and then we'll move into talking about conservation next, if that's all right.
Excellent, great. So I'll put a reminder for my friends both on Zoom and in YouTube. If you are joining us from Zoom, you can use that Q&A function to ask Dr. Kapfer any questions. And on YouTube, you can sign in and use that chat function. So while we are waiting for some of our friends to type in some of those questions, Doc, I have a question for you. And I think maybe a question that I'd like some of our viewers to think a little bit about. And so my question is, why do we care about these interactions, right? So like, why is it so important that we study these interactions?
It's a great question, and we'll actually start getting into that a little bit when we talk about conservation. But one of the
Oh, did I jumped the gun there a little
Oh,
bit,
that's
huh?
okay. No, not at all, not at all. Just briefly, I'll mention that one of the reasons we're interested in studying these interactions is not just so we can better understand the organisms that we're interested in. Obviously, we better understand what those organisms need when they know something about their ecology, but we also can use that information to help conserve or protect them into the future.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to start off with a question from YouTube that asks, why did you start working with animals?
Well, that is a great question. Without boring you with too many details, I always really, really loved nature and the outdoors ever since I was incredibly young. Early on, that kind of manifested itself as an interest in dinosaurs. And when I found out that dinosaurs were extinct, in my very young mind, the closest living thing was a lizard, which is not entirely accurate, but at the same time, I started to focus on amphibians, reptiles. That expanded into other forms of wildlife. My grandmother was very, very an avid bird watcher and bird feeder. She lived in the country, so I learned a lot about these organisms just being outside, and that fueled my interest. And when I got to high school and early college, I deviated a little bit because I was, as you do in college, try and investigate what you're mostly interested in. But eventually, I came back to biology and focused on that as my career path.
I love that. I don't know if I've ever heard another herpetologist say that they got into it because of dinosaurs, but as somebody who works in a natural history museum that includes dinosaurs, that makes me really happy. I like
Oh,
that a
good.
lot.
Oh, I love dinosaurs. I love it. I mean, I don't like the fact that they're all extinct, but I'm really interested in extinct critters. And in fact, my vertebrate zoology class, which runs in the summer, I talk a lot about extinct forms of species like dinosaurs. So,
Awesome. Awesome. And then I'm gonna give a plug for some of the kids watching too, that if you are interested in dinosaurs, not only could you go into herpetology, but you could also go into ornithology because birds are like the great, 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 great ancestors of, or I guess great grandchildren of dinosaurs.
yeah, in fact, you're
All right.
probably better served to go into ornithology, it seems these days,
Maybe.
because it's much more related. But
All right, I have another question actually in Zoom here, and it dovetails really well with talking about amphibians and reptiles. So someone wants to know how many types of amphibians and reptiles are in Wisconsin?
Well, that's a great question. So, our species richness of amphibians and reptiles in Wisconsin breaks down roughly like this. There's 21, 22-ish snakes. That's our most species rich group. We have 7 salamanders. I can't remember the exact numbers of frogs. It's around 15-ish. There's around 15-ish turtles. Maybe it's 12. And then we have 4 lizards, and that's it. So we don't have a huge species richness, but our most species rich group, and when we talk about species richness, I should say, species richness is a count of how many species are in an area. And so our most species rich group, or the group that has the most species in it in Wisconsin, are the snakes.
Very nice. Alrighty. There's another question about species too. Someone wants to know if you've ever found an exciting or unusual species, and what is the favorite thing that you've found?
Oh my gosh, people ask me this question a lot, surprisingly, and you'd think I'd have a better answer for it because I get asked a lot. But at the same time, there are so many different organisms that excite me, and so my favorites are these large snakes that I have. Some of my favorites, these large snakes in the picture here on the slide, the big gopher snake or bull snake, the timber rattlesnake, one of our 2 venomous species that are both very rare, so you don't have to worry about running into them very frequently. But I also, over the weekend, I was in northern Wisconsin on a fishing trip, and we encountered a female bear with 3 cubs. That was an incredible experience. It was, within feet of our cabin that we were staying in. It was also incredibly exciting recently to have observed a hooded warbler near the property I live on. So it's really difficult for me to just pick what my favorite of all things is ever. So there's just so many things to choose from, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I really like that you said too, that one of your favorite things that you've seen is something really close to home, right? That you said it's you know, where you live. And I really like that too for those of us joining us that like nature and science and ecology is all around us. It doesn't have to be in fancy locations. It can be in your own backyard, which is really cool.
100%.
Um, Although I did just say that, and now I do have another question that does ask about a fancy place or the coolest place. It says, where's the coolest place your work has let you travel?
Well, so this is going to be a very boring response, unfortunately. I actually grew up in Wisconsin. I was educated entirely in the UW system. I did my undergrad and my master's at UW La Crosse, and I did my PhD at UW Milwaukee. I lived in North Carolina for a brief period, teaching at a private school, college there called Elon University, and then eventually got the job here at UW Whitewater. And so I haven't traveled extensively, and to be honest with you, most of my interests lie here in Wisconsin. We have such an incredible diversity of species in Wisconsin. I've rarely felt the need or drive to go elsewhere to study things that interest me. Now, that is, I think I am unusual in that regard when it comes to people interested in ecology, especially amphibians and reptiles. If you study amphibians and reptiles, you want to be in South America or, someplace where there is lots of species. But throughout my life, it has always worked out to primarily study things here in Wisconsin. But I think it does highlight that there's lots of cool stuff to study here as well.
Yeah. And then I actually just got a follow-up question about that. This is, what is your favorite place in Wisconsin?
I absolutely love. So growing up, I always thought that southeastern Wisconsin was boring. I always thought it was primarily Milwaukee, Waukesha, very heavily developed urban. But since living in Whitewater, I have learned about the beauty of the Southern Kettle Moraine State Forest, which is a fantastic, fantastic area in general for investigation. But I did my PhD work at in prairies in Sauk County, right, western Wisconsin, and I love the bluff habitat of those western Wisconsin prairies. And so those are some of my favorite places to do work. Unfortunately, they're far away. Well, relatively speaking, couple-hour drive. I can't just go there easily. But those are some of my favorite places to go to look for snakes, for example.
Love that. Awesome. All right. It looks like we do not have any additional questions now. So I'll have us move on and then we'll have more time for questions at the end with Dr. Kapfer.
That sounds great.
All
So,
right.
I had said we were going to talk about, what is ecology and what is conservation. So I think this is probably a great segue now to start switching over to talk about what is conservation. And again, many of you have probably heard the term conservation in the context of ecology to a degree. Conservation as a discipline is relatively new. Conservation biology is relatively new. It probably really became the most prominent, or it rose to prominence in the 1970s. So that might seem like a long time ago to many of you, but relative to the fact that ecology was, first sort of invented long, long before the 1970s, this is a relatively new discipline. And one of the primary goals, if not the primary goal of conservation, is to stop extinction, right? Now, it's probably useful at this point to define what something being extinct means. And many of you probably know this, but extinction, or something is considered extinct when it is no longer living anywhere on Earth, right? It's not alive in the wild, it's not alive in zoos, it's not alive anywhere. It is extinct, no longer alive anywhere on Earth. Now, extinction can be a natural process, right? And extinctions happen naturally throughout the history of this planet, or have happened throughout the history of this planet. We've talked about dinosaurs before. Dinosaurs went extinct because this asteroid hit the Earth and it forever changed their environment and their ecologies. And so as the result of that, all dinosaurs today are extinct in the form they were in during the Cretaceous. We have descendants in the form of birds that still remain. But extinction is something that is a natural process. But when we're thinking about conservation in the modern sense, conservation biologists are primarily interested in trying to stop extinctions that are caused by humans, right? So conservation biologists today are mostly concerned with stopping extinctions that humans cause by their actions. So here are two species that were driven to extinction by the actions of humans, right? On the right of the screen is the passenger pigeon, and in the lower left of the screen is the Tasmanian tiger. And so the passenger pigeon, by all accounts, could have been the most numerous vertebrate that ever lived. Almost certainly the numerous vertebrate that ever lived in North America. James Audubon, who is a very famous ornithologist, talked about swarms or flocks of these passenger pigeons that spanned the horizon in all directions and darkened the sky. But these passenger pigeons currently are extinct. The Tasmanian tiger, which is even though it looks like a dog, right? It's or a wolf or a coyote, some sort of mammal like that. It's actually a marsupial. So it is more closely related to kangaroos, opossums, and koalas than it is wolves or coyotes. But that was an organism that has also been, it's found in Australia, or it was found in Australia and New Zealand. That organism is also currently extinct due to the actions of people. And the reasons why they are currently extinct is because people indiscriminately removed them from the wild. So with the passenger pigeon, there are many accounts historically of individuals going out and simply shooting as many as they possibly could in a short amount of time, in some cases for food, but in many cases as target practice. And so to be able to take something that was arguably one of the most numerous vertebrate animals that existed in North America, and essentially indiscriminately shooting them until they were extinct, that takes a lot of sort of negligent behavior on the part of humans. When it comes to the Tasmanian tiger, they were indiscriminately killed because of the same reason people sometimes don't like coyotes and wolves today, and that they were concerned that these Tasmanian tigers would eat cattle or eat domestic animals that they were keeping in agricultural situations. So both of these are very sad stories, in my opinion, of organisms that were once alive, but humans, because of our actions, caused them to go extinct. So if we think about the ways in which humans cause extinction, right? There's actually a number of different ways in which humans cause extinction. We've talked about overhunting, but another example would be not just overhunting, but overcollecting. So it's not uncommon for wild organisms to be collected, brought into captivity, and then distributed for sale for various reasons across the globe. And one of the problems with this is that these organisms can so easily be shipped all over the place. They can come from, any continent and potentially be shipped to any other continent. And so as the result of that, and because people like exotic animals as pets, many organisms are collected in a way that's unsustainable. In other words, they are removed from the wild in greater numbers than they can replenish or maintain through their own reproduction. So because of that, their populations start to decline. So overhunting and overcollecting are huge problems and can cause extinction. Pollution, most people are aware of the impact that pollution can have. I mean, if we consider the toxic substances and the trash that can end up in water, and those things can have a negative effect on lots of living organisms. They can destroy habitat, or they can cause toxicity. They can result in things dying because they've been poisoned by these sort of toxicants that have been dumped in the water on accident. So pollution is a huge problem and can cause extinctions. We also have something that is very problematic called invasive species. Now, invasive species are species that come from one location and are brought either on accident or on purpose to another location and released there. When they get to that new location, there's nothing to keep them in check. They don't have any predators that eat them, for example, or they don't have any things that compete with them and keep their numbers small, and they explode in population size and they start to take over. And there are so many examples of invasive species globally, and even in Wisconsin. One example is this. This is what is called a zebra mussel. And the zebra mussel is a little sort of clam or a bivalve or a clam type organism that was accidentally introduced from another continent. It was introduced here into the Great Lakes area on accident. And all of this, you can see all of these rocks, everything, the logs are all covered in these tiny little zebra mussels. Each one is about that big, and they create this coating around things. And they outcompete all the native types of invertebrates that live in these areas. They also change water quality so they can affect fish. And they can damage infrastructure, so they can build up on bridges and water intake for power plants and et cetera. So invasive species that were introduced by humans on accident or on purpose can also lead to extinction when they outcompete native species or destroy native species habitat. But all of these explanations pale in comparison to habitat destruction. Habitat destruction is without a doubt the number one reason why all species go extinct and why all species globally decline in numbers. Those other things that I mentioned are surely important as well, but the number one cause for why species go extinct and decline in population is loss of habitat. And there are lots of reasons why people destroy habitat: to build houses, roads, parking lots, all of these things, to harvest wood, to mine for minerals, to grow food, in some cases, cutting down forests to grow food for survival. So habitat destruction is without a doubt the number one reason why species go extinct today. And we can see the profound effect that habitat destruction can have when we look at this landscape before and after deforestation has happened. So there is, without a doubt, all of the organisms, or we can say without a doubt that all of the organisms that would live in this landscape now have nowhere to go. So it's important, if we want to conserve organisms, to say, look, we can't hunt them, or we can't remove them from the wild as pets, or we have to minimize pollution that would kill them in the wild. But it's even more important to say we need to protect a place for them to live. Because if we say, well, we're not going to take them out of the wild and make them pets, but they have nowhere to live, then they will not remain. And so the number one way that we can offset extinction currently is through trying to protect habitat for organisms. And that is without a doubt the number one reason. Now, we've talked about these things. Why are ecology, or we've talked about, I'm sorry, defining ecology. We've talked about the ways in which humans can, or what conservation is, and we've talked about the ways in which humans can cause extinctions. So let's talk a little bit more, sort of on top of the question that Maisie had asked before. Let's talk a little bit about why ecology and conservation are important. Like, why should an individual be interested in ecology and conservation? Well, if you're at all interested in animals, understanding their ecology and understanding what they need as living organisms and how we can stop their extinction helps us preserve them. So, for people who are mostly interested in living organisms, people who are mostly interested in preserving and conserving those organisms, if we have a better understanding of their ecology, then we can have a better understanding of how we can conserve them so they don't go extinct, and we can make sure that these organisms persist for as long as as possible. Now, some people are less interested in living organisms existing for the fact that they should exist, and are most interested in how these topics of ecology and conservation affect them as humans. So we can answer that question by looking at the impact that ecology and conservation and our understandings of it can have on human health. And there's a couple of examples that we can point to in this regard. So first and foremost, when we take animals from the wild and keep them in cages and bring them in to sell them as pets, what that means is that we are bringing these animals that would otherwise be out in nature into close proximity with people, or we're bringing them in close to where people live. Animals can carry diseases that can spread to people. And there's a fair amount of evidence to support how the COVID-19 pandemic started. So removing these animals from the wild that otherwise would be in the wild, and so the diseases that might affect us, we're not exposed to, that changes when you start bringing these animals into close proximity with people. You collect them to ship them for pets, or you collect them for other purposes into areas where they're concentrated. When we do that, the diseases that they are carrying can more likely spread to people, and it can cause lots of problems, as it did with the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we look at then the fact that these collected animals get spread all over the world, it's very easy for us to see how it is that if you collect a bunch of animals to a location that might carry disease, and then you start shipping those animals all over the world, it's easy to imagine how these diseases could be spread around. there's another important human health aspect to ecology and conservation that we can talk about that hits a little bit closer to home. It involves something called Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is a disease that's spread by being bitten by a deer tick, specifically a deer tick that is infected with the disease-causing agent, or the thing that causes the disease. Now, not all deer ticks carry Lyme disease, so it's important to mention that. But diseases or deer ticks that carry Lyme disease, then if you accidentally get bitten by one, it's possible they could transmit it to you. Now, deer ticks need hosts to survive. They are a parasite. They live off of, sucking the blood and tissues from other organisms. In the wild, the hosts that deer ticks require to exist are white-tailed deer and wild rodents like white-footed mice, right? So these ticks that can maybe carry things like Lyme disease need things like white-tailed deer and these little rodents like white-footed mice to complete their life cycle, right? If those organisms don't exist in large numbers, then the deer ticks have nothing to live on and their populations don't get very big. So basically what this means is that if you have more of these hosts, like white-tailed deer and white-footed mice, that's going to potentially lead to more disease that ticks carry, like Lyme disease. So the question then that we might want to ask specifically regards to this is, why are there growing numbers of things like deer ticks in the upper Midwest? And that the answer to that is because there are more hosts for those deer ticks. So the next question would be, why are there more hosts now? In other words, why are there more white-tailed deer? Why are there more white-footed mice now than there were in the past, perhaps? One of the possible answers to this is that we start to think about ecologically what types of organisms eat mice and white-tailed deer. Organisms that eat mice and white-tailed deer keep their numbers smaller, and so ticks don't have as many of them to live on. Well, the obvious things that eat rodents are coyotes, among other things, predatory birds, etc. And the obvious things that eat white-tailed deer might be something like a gray wolf. There are other things as well. So if we have over time removed these predators, which we have, right? Humans have over time removed coyotes. We've almost driven gray wolf to extinction in certain areas. In Wisconsin, they were gone for a long period of time, but migrated back to the state from Minnesota eventually. But we have, as humans, removed these types of organisms over time. So we've removed the predators of white-tailed deer and rodents. And because of that, white-tailed deer and rodent populations, in part because of that, white-tailed deer and rodent populations have expanded. And that means there's more hosts for ticks that can potentially carry something like Lyme disease. So there is a direct human health benefit. There are several direct human health benefits for trying to conserve organisms, understand ecological relationships. So it's not just people that like animals that want to understand ecology and conservation. From a standpoint of human health, these are also very important subjects. So the sort of next logical step for us to think about is, how can we help? If conservation is important, if ecology is important, how can individuals, you all or me or any individual, your parents, etc., how can we help conserve organisms so that they don't go extinct? Well, I think first and foremost, it's very important to spend time outside. Just being out and exposed to wild places helps us appreciate them. If we're constantly inside, looking down at phones, looking at the TV, we don't really understand the importance of, or it's harder to understand the importance of ecology and conservation because we don't experience those types of things, right? So just getting outside to parks and natural areas in your vicinity and experiencing the outside helps us better appreciate it. Then we can further expand this by learning about living things, right? Going out and not just experiencing them, but actually studying them, learning about the living things, learning about ecology, right? Once we start to learn about what these things mean, then we really, really get a better idea about ecology and the importance of conservation. So we can then learn about conservation initiatives and how we can sort of help those along, right? So for example, if we learn about living things, we learn about ecology, we learn about what the outdoors needs and how those things happen, then we can start to think about human impacts on the natural world, right? And we can start to think about how the things we do affect the natural world. And when we start to sort of think about, wow, if I'm, outside doing X, Y, and Z, I might be having a negative impact, then we start to say, wait a second, I better change my habits a little bit. I better do something a little bit different. I don't need to dump this trash on the ground, right? I should throw it in a receptacle. Or I don't necessarily need to cut down all these native trees. I can leave those and try and make them present as, or leave them as present for habitat for other organisms. So if we start to learn about living things, learn about ecology and conservation, then think about how our actions impact the natural world, then we can start to think about what we do and how we can correct it by changing our habits and then change our habits appropriately. So I hope that this all makes sense. And if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. And at this point in time, I guess I'll probably open things up for questions if that's all right with you, Maisie.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'll put another little reminder in there. If you have questions for Dr. Kapfer, if you're on Zoom, you can put it in the Q&A section. It's been pretty active actually since you've been talking. And then also on YouTube, not quite as active, but any other friends on YouTube, if you'd like to log in and enter some questions in the chat, we can ask them that. So one of the questions that we've got quite a few, and I want to make sure that we get to as many as I can. One of the questions asked about rewilding, and it asked if rewilding is a good conservation method. So first, I'd like if we could maybe talk about what rewilding is for those of you who might not be familiar, and then maybe answer that question. Is it a good conservation method?
So rewilding is a term that can be interpreted a couple of different ways. So I'll interpret it in a couple of different ways so we can understand what we're talking about. So the idea behind rewilding could be, on the one hand, similar to restoration. In other words, trying to take something that is damaged, a wild place that is damaged, and restoring it back to what it was before it was damaged. Okay. Now, there are some people that are interested in rewilding who also then say, you know what we should do is try and return these ecosystems, not just to their previously undamaged state, maybe 100 years ago, but try and return it to the state it was at the end of the Pleistocene, before Europeans even arrived in North America. So the idea of returning things to that previous state of, around the end of the Pleistocene, for example, is really interesting, but it would be incredibly difficult to enact. Restoration, on the other hand, is something that we absolutely should engage in, right? Trying to take something that was at one point in time disturbed, it was turned into a parking lot or an agricultural field, and trying to restore that so that it is suitable habitat for pollinators and birds and all insects and all plants and all of these different things. That's absolutely something that we should engage in. And restoration ecology is a huge area of study, and there's lots of effort put on trying to restore disturbed areas to something similar to what they were prior to that disturbance.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you. This next question, actually, it kind of dovetails a little bit with what you're talking about in terms of trying to not just restore habitat, but like bring it back to what it was, the end of the Pleistocene. So there's a question we have about, I think there's recent news stories about the quote unquote de-extinction of dire wolves. So the person who put this in the chat wants to get your thoughts about that from an ecologist perspective, specifically how that relates to like policy. But I'm also curious about, maybe some of our other friends online might be curious too about if you have any concerns about that, just from a general ecological biodiversity perspective as well.
So this is obviously a very complicated topic, right? And it's also going to be, if it isn't already, very controversial, right? And so first and foremost, remember that there's no hard evidence to back anything about these organisms currently, because it's just something that's getting started, right? So there's no hard evidence to back what their impact could be at this point. So we're sort of going on our best guesses, best thoughts, et cetera, at this point. But first, those dire wolves are not actually true dire wolves, right? They're hybrids. And so despite all of that effort, these are not genetically pure dire wolves. And so you're not bringing back a dire wolf, you're bringing some sort of approximation of a dire wolf. Me personally, I don't know that that is a valuable way to spend huge amounts of money. Of course, that was mostly privately funded. So if people, people can spend their money the way they want as long as they're not hurting others. But the reality is that if we think about the amount of money that was spent on, trying to bring back this approximation of a direwolf, there are real conservation issues going on right now that could benefit dramatically from those types of resources. But again, people can spend that money on it was privately funded, right? So as to whether or not it will have a benefit or be harmful, it, if we don't have the other players in an ecosystem that direwolves interacted with, there is it seems highly unlikely to me that we could recreate the type of ecosystem that they were part of. So if you were to release a bunch of hybrid direwolves into the wild, for example, if it ever got to that point, they're nowhere near that point, by the way, I should point out. But if it ever got to that point, canines are incredibly territorial. And so, what's some of the first species that will be directly affected by that? Well, we already have apex predators and gray wolves here in the upper Midwest, right? They could obviously be affected. Coyotes could obviously be negatively affected. So, we have these living organisms that already, especially when it comes to something like a gray wolf, require conservation. And so, that topic is very controversial, and again, you should not take my word as gospel, and you should not necessarily look at or listen to what I say as the definitive answer, because it's something that is constantly evolving. But those are my current thoughts on it. Those may change if more evidence comes to light, however.
I love that. I love that. I also love I'm just going to plug the littlest bit of science that our thoughts can change as we learn more evidence.
Absolutely.
Okay, I have some awesome questions on YouTube, looks like from a classroom. So I'm going to kind of go down the line here. First question I see is from Audrey. Audrey is wondering, what is the most common snake in Wisconsin?
Great question. The most common snake, and probably the most commonly seen snake, is what is called the common garter snake. So sometimes people will see the snake and say it's a gardener snake or a garden snake, but it's not. It's a garter snake, Garter. And it's sort of black with long yellow stripes that run the length of its body. Really, really common, very commonly seen. There are two other very common species, though, that are very small and people probably don't see very often simply because they're kind of buried down below the grass duff and under debris. And that's the red-bellied snake and the northern brown snake, or the Dekay's brown snake, Dekay. They're both very common, but we don't often see them because they're usually hidden underground. Whereas the common garter snake is something that is and they can handle disturbance. You'll find them in green spaces and parks and things like that as well.
Great. All right. Taylor is wondering, what age did you start searching for animals?
Well, I mean, some of my earliest memories of being outside were being at the park and catching leopard frogs, right? As a kid, I grew up in Stoughton, Wisconsin. Also, seeing a female painted turtle up in our garden who had come up to nest when I was very, very young. So, as soon as I interacted with those things, I was basically hooked, right? And so, at a very young age, I don't know the exact age, but this was, elementary school.
Very nice. All right. Mason is wondering, is there an animal that we are concerned about now that might become extinct in Wisconsin?
Absolutely. There are numerous examples that we could point to. Just among amphibians and reptiles, for example, the ornate box turtle, which is our only fully terrestrial turtle species here in Wisconsin, incredibly rare. It lives in sand prairies, which are also a rare and declining habitat. So the ornate box turtle could very easily go extinct in Wisconsin. Also, the Massasauga, which is one of our two rattlesnake species here in Wisconsin. It's incredibly rare, and you don't have to be afraid of it. You're highly unlikely to encounter it, but it's one that could go extinct in Wisconsin. So those are just two examples. There are many more that we could point to, however, among other groups as well.
All right. Cade is wondering, how many gray wolves have been killed in Wisconsin, and how do we get the numbers back up?
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question about how many have been killed. The DNR does monitor those populations very closely, and so they do have reports annually what numbers die, and they are killed for various reasons. Some are hit by cars, some die of natural causes like disease. So there's lots of different reasons why wolves decline. But today in Wisconsin, I should point out that they are protected, right? So Wisconsin wolves are currently protected, and currently the population size, it's kind of a conservation success story, right? The population size is larger than they thought they could get it to originally when they first showed up back in the state. I think it was the early 90s when gray wolves first came back to Wisconsin from Minnesota. So their numbers have expanded. We have basically none. We have no established packs in southern Wisconsin. Most of the established packs are in central Wisconsin and further north. And so here in southern Wisconsin, we have these, very, very large numbers of things like deer, for example. We have a huge deer herd in southern Wisconsin. And wolves are not the only thing that contribute to that. There are other things that contribute to the very large deer herd size as well. But yeah, so I don't know the exact number of wolves that have been removed, but the DNR issues reports every year that have those numbers.
All right. It sounds like maybe being protected at the level like government protected might help get those numbers back up
Yeah,
for
and their
for
numbers
Kate's
are right
question.
now. They have gotten when they first started the wolf recovery program, they had a number they wanted to reach of wolves in Wisconsin. Then and they've exceeded that because it's been relatively successful, which is a great story, right? So I don't want to give the impression that wolves are about to go extinct tomorrow, but they are something that need our protection because they are treated harshly by people, and they are also something that are very important parts of our ecosystems. If we don't have those types of top predators, then the things that exist below them, their ecosystems and their ecosystem interactions are forever changed.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. Lucy is wondering, what is the most dangerous animal you've handled?
Oh boy. Well, so it's all sort of relative, right? I've handled venomous snakes, right? Particularly timber rattlesnakes here in Wisconsin, and they could cause damage through envenomation if I were to get bit, but they are not dangerous because, first of all, I shouldn't let me back up. They can be dangerous if you are not aware of how to deal with them. So they are not something you need to be afraid of when you are outside in the wild because they exist in really rugged habitats, right? So they're hard to sort of find in the first place. They're really hard to interact with. And if you were accidentally bitten by one, it would cause damage, right? There's no doubt about that. But they are something that basically sits in one place. The only reason I've ever had one even strike out at me is because I had to pick it up with a tongs or a hook to collect data on it. I would never do that to a snake that I didn't need to collect data on, right? A rattlesnake. But because I needed to collect data on those snakes, I had to try and pick them up with appropriate equipment, a hook that kept them away from me. And because of that, they struck at me. But otherwise, those snakes are, relatively speaking, pretty docile. So they can be dangerous, but I wouldn't consider them to be a threat to your safety under most situations. The snapping turtle that I'm holding in this picture can certainly cause damage, but the only way you get bitten by snapping turtles is when you're doing what I'm doing. In this case, I was out with students showing them how to conduct surveys for turtles, and we caught one and had to take it out of the live trap and release it. So I had to pick it up and move it. And in that situation, you have to be careful because they can cause damage when they bite. But they are not something you need to be concerned about when you are walking around in the outdoors. They're really not very aggressive unless they are on land out of the water and you try to pick them up or harass them in some way.
All right. I think we have one more question on YouTube, and that is from Brody, who would like to know if you have any pets.
I do. I have a dog, a golden retriever named Sweetie Pie, and we have I named the dog, by the way. People think that my wife and kid named the dog, but I named it. Anyways, my kid also has a pet axolotl. We have a goldfish. I used to have all kinds of pets. I used to have snakes. I had, tons of fish in fish tanks, and as I got older, I realized that it was for the snakes, for example, because I could see them in the wild, it was much more enjoyable for me to see them in their native setting than it was to keep them as pets, right? And that's just personally my preference. Some people love keeping them as pets, and that's fantastic as long as it's legal to do so. They're not a protected species. And the same thing with fish. It became more interesting for me to see them under natural conditions than it was to keep them in captivity. And again, that's just my personal preference. But I don't have any right now aside from Sweetie Pie and the axolotl and that goldfish. So
I mean, axolotl sounds pretty cool too. So,
yes, it is pretty cool.
um, all right, so I think we are, it's kind of perfect timing. We're nearly out of time, and I think we are also out of questions. So I want to first thank all of you who are joining us, who asked really amazing questions and used your curiosity. That's amazing. And I would also like to thank Dr. Josh Kapfer for joining us and giving us his time to help us learn a little bit more about ecology, about Wisconsin, and about his job too. So I have one more question. I know we finished up all the questions here. I have one more question for you, and that is, if someone wanted to do your job, or if someone wanted to learn a little bit more about what it means to be a conservation biologist, what kind of schooling and qualifications would they want?
That's a great question. So usually to work in ecology and conservation professionally, you would get a degree in biology, usually with a conservation, ecology, or environmental science concentration. So, for example, here at Whitewater, we have a biology degree and then concentrations in ecology, evolution, behavior, or concentrations in aquatic, freshwater, marine ecosystems. So you would go to college and get experience. I always recommend people go to schools where they're going to be in small class sizes in college, where they're going to get direct applied experience. So we take all of our students outside to do survey work and learn how to identify things out in the wild rather than just in the classroom. So get as much applied hands-on experience that you can get as an undergraduate, and then, start working in the field a little bit. And if you want to sort of go higher in that chain, if you wanted to get a more advanced position, it would probably require going to graduate school to some level, maybe getting a master's degree. And if you want to work as a college professor like I am, then it would require you get a PhD or a doctorate, which is another level of graduate school. But you can work as an ecologist and a conservation biologist without getting a PhD and without going to graduate school. And in fact, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has great programs for citizen scientists. So these are people who can be trained to collect data, real usable data for the DNR through these citizen science programs. You can be trained through their program and not have any type of degree. Now you're volunteering. This is not something you would get paid for, but worthwhile conservation work. So those are some of the ways.
I love that. And I also love that you pointed out the citizen science option too, right? So, no matter who we are and no matter our background, we can still help out when it comes to conservation and to contributing to science. All right. So thank you again, Dr. Kopfer. We're so grateful to have you. And thank you again to those of us joining. Like I said, this is our last Learn with an Expert of the school year. So if you would like to hear more about other Learn with an Expert events for next year, other education events, you can sign up for our educator newsletter at mpm.edu, or you can visit mpm.edu/outreach for more information. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.